There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you slept. You wake up and immediately start preparing, not for anything dramatic, just for the day, the person you'll be in the next conversation, the tone you'll use at work, the version of yourself you'll pull on like a coat before you walk out the door. And it's not hard, that's the strange part. It's actually easy. You've been doing it so long, it doesn't feel like effort anymore. But somewhere in the back of all that ease, something is very quietly asking, who is this for? Not in a crisis kind of way, not a dramatic unraveling, just a small, persistent question that surfaces at the wrong moments, in the pause after someone asks how you're doing, in the car ride home when the performance is over and nothing fills the space, in the 3 seconds between answering your phone and performing the voice you always answer in. You're not broken. Nothing went catastrophically wrong. By almost any external measure, you're fine. But there's a difference between being fine and being present. And that difference has been growing quietly for longer than you want to admit. Carl Jung spent a lifetime studying this gap between the self the world sees and the self that exists underneath. He didn't call it a crisis. He called it a condition, nearly universal, nearly inevitable, and, if you're willing, navigable. This is about that gap, and it begins, like most things worth understanding, with how you got here. You didn't build your mask because you were dishonest. You built it because you were smart. Watch a child figure out a room. They are conducting a real-time study. What makes the adults smile? What earns attention? What causes withdrawal? What is dangerous to say out loud? They are learning, as fast as they can, what version of themselves is safest to present. This is what Jung called the persona, a word borrowed deliberately from Roman theater, where it meant the mask worn by actors to project a character to the audience. Jung was precise about this. The persona is not a deception, it's a function, a social interface, a necessary translation between the interior world and the exterior one. Everyone has one. The question is whether you know you're wearing it. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, Jung wrote that the persona is designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. 2 purposes, projection and concealment. Neither one is inherently wrong. Both serve survival. The problem comes later, because the mask doesn't just serve you in the moments you consciously deploy it. It starts to serve you everywhere. It learns the territory. It gets better. Your persona became expert at your particular environment, your family, your school, your workplace, your social circle, and it adapted so well that at some point it stopped being a strategy and became a default. Here's what that looks like in practice. You become very good at reading rooms. You know what to say and when not to say it. You know how to make people comfortable. You know how to present a version of yourself that earns the response you need. These feel like social skills, and they are, but they are also the fingerprints of a persona that has become the primary mode of operation. The self underneath doesn't disappear. Jung was clear about this. It doesn't die, it waits. But waiting has a cost. The energy required to sustain a gap between who you present and who you are is not free. It's paid in the currency of low-level exhaustion, the kind that sleep doesn't fix. There's another cost that's harder to name. The longer you wear a mask that works, the more dangerous it becomes to question it, because questioning the mask means questioning everything that's been built on top of it. The career, the relationships, the reputation, the life. Jung described a particular kind of psychological trap, persona inflation, where a person stops having a persona and becomes one. They don't wear the doctor, the good son, the competent professional, the easygoing friend. They are it. And the distance between the role and the reality collapses until there's no interior space left to retreat to. This is not a character flaw. It's an almost logical outcome of a system that rewards performance over presence. You get promoted for your persona. You get loved for your persona. You get included for your persona. The reinforcement is constant and the feedback is clear. Keep being this and things go well. Until they don't, or until you're lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering why, despite everything going reasonably well, you feel like a stranger in your own life. There are 3 ways this shows up. Not theories, patterns that will either land or they won't. The first one is this. You have become very good at performing your own emotions, not faking them. That's too crude a word for what's actually happening. More like, you feel something, and before that feeling can fully form, you've already assessed whether it's appropriate, whether it fits the current situation, whether expressing it is safe, and then you produce a refined version of it, filtered, timed, and calibrated for the room. You've gotten so practiced at this that you don't always notice you're doing it. You notice it in retrospect sometimes. A moment that felt important suddenly seems slightly off, like you were watching yourself have it from a foot outside your body. A conversation where you said something true, but in a voice that wasn't quite yours. A photograph where you're smiling in exactly the right way, which is almost exactly the thing that makes it feel wrong. This isn't performance in the theatrical sense. It's something subtler. The small, almost automatic editing of experience that happens when you've learned that the unfiltered version is too much, too little, too strange, or too risky. The second pattern is quieter, and for a lot of people, more unsettling. You don't know what you want. Not really. You know what you're supposed to want. You can recite the list without thinking, the career progression, the relationship milestones, the lifestyle markers that signal a life well constructed. You chose them, presumably, or they chose you. At some point, the distinction stopped being obvious. But ask yourself something that doesn't have a socially legible answer. Not where do you see yourself in 5 years. Ask what you would do if no one you know would ever find out. What you'd spend a free afternoon on if there was no version of it to report back. What you actually think about things you've never said out loud. Most people find this question difficult, not because the answer is hidden, but because the answering mechanism, the one that scans for what's appropriate and expected before responding, fires so fast that it answers before the real answer can surface. Jung called this the gap between ego and self. The ego knows the approved answers. The self knows the true ones. And when the persona has been running the show for long enough, the ego and self have so little contact that the question feels almost unanswerable. The third pattern is the one that most people don't talk about because it's slightly embarrassing to admit. You feel most like yourself when no one is watching, not in a private vice kind of way, in a quieter, stranger way. Late at night when you can't sleep, the few minutes before you have to be somewhere, the drive home when the day is over and there's no one to be competent for. Something softens, something surfaces that doesn't fit the organized presentation you've been making. And the strange thing, the thing that doesn't get discussed, is that this feels both more real and less trustworthy than the version everyone else knows. Because the version everyone else knows has been tested and confirmed. It works, it earns things. The quieter version is unconfirmed. It hasn't been approved yet. There's a line from Jung from New Paths in Psychology 1912 that doesn't appear in many self-help compilations. In each of us there is another whom we do not know. That other person isn't a shadow in the threatening sense, not necessarily repressed darkness or hidden vice. Sometimes it's just the person who has preferences that were never consulted, who has opinions that were never aired, who got very good at not existing in any room that had other people in it. These 3 patterns, the performed emotion, the borrowed desire, the self that appears only when the audience is gone, are not symptoms of something wrong with you. They are symptoms of a persona that got promoted beyond its original job description. Here's what almost every narrative about authenticity gets wrong. They position the persona as the villain, the false self, the ego trap, the thing you need to destroy in order to become real. And they frame the whole arc as a rescue operation, you uncovering the true self that was being held captive by the mask. Jung's actual view was more interesting and more honest. The persona wasn't a mistake, it was the right tool for the job. The child who built it was solving a real problem. How do I stay loved, safe, and included in this particular environment? The answer was clever. The execution was often very good. The mask worked. The problem isn't that you built one. The problem is that nobody told you it was possible to take it off. Jung's concept of individuation, the central project of his analytical psychology, is not about dismantling who you've been, it's about expanding who you can be, about integrating the parts of yourself that the persona couldn't afford to include, about becoming slowly, uncomfortably, and without any guarantee of social reward, more whole. He was careful to say this is not the work of the first half of life. The first half is legitimately about building a persona, a competence, a place in the world. That work is real and it matters. The question isn't whether you should have done it. The question is whether the same structure still fits, because structures that help you survive at 20 don't always serve you at 32 or 38, or whenever the quiet voice starts asking questions that the persona has no good answer to. In The Ego and the Unconscious, Jung wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." Read that a second time. Not just what others think you are, what you yourself think you are. The persona isn't only external. It's the story you've told yourself so many times that it stopped feeling like a story. The invitation Jung describes, and it is an invitation, not a demand, not a crisis you have to engineer, is to begin noticing the gap between the rehearsed response and the real one, between what you pursue because you want it and what you pursue because it confirms the version of you that's already been agreed upon, between the self that performs and the self that is. The grief in this process is real and worth naming. If you come to understand that some of your choices, not all, but some, were made more by the persona than by you, there's a particular sadness that comes with that. The years have some different texture in retrospect. That grief doesn't make the choices wrong. The persona chose the best it could with what it had, but grief is part of the honest accounting, and honest accounting is where new choices become possible. Jung didn't promise that this gets easier. Individuation is not a project with a completion date. There's no point at which you've fully removed the mask and found the true self waiting underneath, unchanged and patient. The self you'll find is not a discovery. It's more like a conversation that you finally start having with the parts of yourself that were never consulted, that learned to be quiet, that waited, and it starts with something that sounds almost trivially small. Noticing when you answer before you've thought, when you perform a feeling instead of having it, when you say yes and your body says something else, when you reach for your phone not because you want to, but because the alternative is a silence that asks too many questions. These are not dramatic wake-up moments. Jung was skeptical of those, the sudden revelation, the transformative experience, the weekend retreat that rewires everything. What he observed was slower and more honest, a gradual, sometimes painful accumulation of small noticings that eventually adds up to a different relationship with yourself. The persona doesn't disappear. You'll still wear it in certain rooms. You should, that's what it's for. But the difference between a persona you can choose and a persona that runs you is the difference between having a language and being trapped inside one. You haven't lost yourself. That's not quite the right frame for what happened. What's more accurate, and in some ways harder to sit with? You built something very functional, very convincing, and for a long time very necessary. And somewhere in the building, you stopped checking whether the architect was still consulted. The architect is still there, quieter than the persona, less impressive at parties, not particularly interested in performing well. But it's the part that surfaces at 3 a.m., that softens when no one needs anything from you, that has opinions no one has ever asked for. The question Jung asks, not in these exact words, but in the direction his entire life's work pointed, is not who are you really? That's too grand, too resolved. The question is smaller, and it's the one I'll leave you with. When was the last time you said something true? Not correct, not kind, not useful, but simply true, not to anyone in particular, just to yourself, in the privacy of your own mind, before the persona got to it. If you can remember, that's where the work begins. If you can't, that's where the work begins.